This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, and welcome. I just wanted to start just by acknowledging I'm calling in from the unceded territory of the Kwantlen and Stolo First Nations people. And we're all working with seeds, and I'm just going to read a little quote out from the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. We understand that seeds are our precious collective inheritance, and it is our responsibility to care for the seeds as part of our responsibility to feed and nourish ourselves and future generations. So let's just keep in mind, these seeds are our ancestors. We've worked with them for a long time, and they've helped us out over the years. So greatest respect to them. This session is going to be led by Siri van Gruen. Siri's passion for sustainable food systems led her to complete a Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture and environmental science, specializing in plant production. During her degree, she spent a field semester in Barbados, researching and development of weed-free soil mixes, and was a farmhand at McGill's Mac Market, helping to supply fresh produce to students and locals. Since 2020, Siri's been working with the BC Seed Security team at Farm Folk City Folk to deliver programming across the province, and is always eager to jump into and learn more about the technical aspects of some of these, the crops we work with. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Siri to take us through biennial seed production.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen. And as I go through this presentation, I really encourage anybody, if you have any input, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. David will let me know what's going on in the chat. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to make this more of an open discussion. So yeah, biennial seed production. So first of all, what is a biennial plant? A biennial plant takes 2 seasons to complete its life cycle. So in the first season, we see that the plant grows vegetatively. And between the seasons, the plant has to go through a cold exposure, which we call vernalization. And in the second season, the plant grows reproductively. So flowers, so we get flowers and it goes to seed. So in this picture, I've just kind of tried to show the life cycle of an onion. So in the first picture, you can see that's onions in its first year. And the second picture, well, you can see on the far right, that's my mom and I replanting onions from the previous year. So you basically just take the onion with the little roots, make sure you go the roots down, cover it up with soil, and it'll just regrow, and you'll eventually get something like that middle picture with the flowers, and you let those flowers open up and turn to seed and then dry down. And then when you harvest them, it should look something like this last picture. And once you're at that stage, you can pretty easily use screen and winnowing techniques to get your clean onion seeds, and then you're ready to plant those for next year. And I'm hoping to show lots of examples throughout this presentation. Even if I don't speak to everything individually, hopefully we'll get to most crops. So most gardeners haven't seen a biennial crop go to flower or seed, as they're used to harvesting the crop in the first year. So I think sometimes it's just really important to watch your plant, you know, go into the garden to see what it looks like in flower, and then watch those flowers, because then you'll be able to see what the seed will look like, because sometimes it'll be stored in pods, kind of like seen in this radishes or all the brassica oleracea, so the kales, the cauliflowers, and sometimes it's more attached to the stems like beets, and sometimes the onions, you see it kind of is in circular shape. So market maturity often occurs in the first year, and seed maturity occurs in the second year. So after the first year, it's a great time to select your best plants and roots. So you can really just decide, this is called roguing. So in your first year, you might decide some of these radishes were too small, or they bolted, so you don't want to keep those genetics. And you can select your best ones to propagate in the next year to grow out. So yeah, in this picture, radishes are a kind of crop that you can do in an annual production for some varieties, though I would suggest, if you can, doing it in 2 years is better. And some radishes just simply won't go to seed in 1 year, like daikons and a lot of the larger ones, really do need a vernalization. But if you're looking at crops like the small red varieties, you can usually plant those early in spring, and just the drops in temperature at night will be enough of a vernalization for those to go to seed in 1 year. And a lot of those smaller red varieties, they've kind of been bred to not really need a vernalization as much. But for a lot of farmers and gardeners, having your crop bolt is an undesirable characteristic. So it's more desirable to plant a bit later in the season. I'll go into that a bit more, just best tips and tricks when to plant and do a vernalization. And we've also done at the farm where we do it all in 1 year using a cooler mid-season, but I'll also speak to that a bit later in the presentation. So market versus seed maturity, as I said, market maturity occurs in the first year and seed maturity occurs in the second year. Here's a picture of us laying out a whole bunch of rutabagas as part of our canopy. So we're looking at the leaves to see if there was any diseases. We're also looking at the roots, especially to see if there's club roots. We're kind of deciding, this is a whole bunch of different varieties. So even in this year, we were actually kind of deciding what rutabagas we wanted to plant, what variety from this trial we wanted to grow for seed the next year. In the end, we did a mixture of rutabagas because we didn't have enough of one variety. But we did a similar thing with our radicchio and saved one variety of them, Bottiglione. So yeah, it's a perfect time. Your first year is to really pick what plants are best. And you always want to save more roots or anything than you think you'll need, because the winter storage, you'll definitely lose a certain percentage of your plants just to rot, or just because a growing tip fell off. So you always want to save a bit more than you think you'll want to plant for next year. And all of the rogued plants are still great to eat. That's another advantage of biennial seed production, is you can often harvest in the first year. Like kale, for example, you can harvest all your leaves in the first year, and the second year you can leave it to go to seed. So don't need to waste. So isolation distances for biennial plants. When growing biennials, make sure to pay attention to isolation distances. Seed Savers Exchange has a really great chart. A lot of biennials do tend to be insect pollinated, so they usually need a bit farther isolation. But a trick you can do is oftentimes you can grow two of the same crop species at the same time, ensuring one is in its first year of growth and the other is in the second year of growth. So let's say you want to grow broccoli and cabbage, or let's say kale and cabbage. You could have grown the cabbage the first year, and then the second year it'll go to seed, and that second year plant your kale, and you can just eat the leaves that year, but they won't cross. As long as if your plants are in the same species, as long as the two varieties are not in flower at the same time. So here I'm talking about separating the flower by time. They won't cross. So be careful for crops that have the tendency to bolt. So let's say you stored your radishes over winter, you planted them out early spring, but then you planted another season's radish. You decided, I also want fresh radishes for eating. If one of your, if it's a different variety and one of those radishes bolts, it could cross with the ones that you're trying to save seed for. And in general, since bolting is an undesirable characteristic, it's best seed saving practice to not save plants that have bolted in their first year. So on the picture of the right, I have a picture of carrots in flower. They're really quite beautiful. But if you see this in the first year, you probably don't want to save that carrot. You probably would prefer a carrot that doesn't look like this in its first year and that you would have to store and replant. So here's just an overview of the most common biennial plants. They're often found in these four families. So your Brassicaceae, so that's collards, kale, colibri, Brussels sprouts. And then second is your Apiaceae, that's like parsnip, carrots, celery. Then you have Alliaceae, that's onions, green onions, shallots, leeks, and then Amaranthaceae. So Swiss chard and beets. And this is just general. There's a few more biennials, but those are the most common vegetable crops families.
As parsnips.
And then there's also Flowering biennials. So here's some of the common ones: black-eyed Susans, Canterbury bells, evening primrose, forget-me-nots, hollyhock, foxglove, mullein. Note some of these may be invasive in your areas, because I know a lot of seed librarians and libraries also have flower crops. So first season growth, here's just some tips and tricks. In general, it's always safer to vernalize your biennial crop indoors if you have the space. But we'll have a bit of a discussion of things you can do outside. So here's some tips. So one is younger plants store over winter best. So in general, crops planted in the spring or early fall will store better compared to crops started in early spring. A bit of an exception to this rule is onions and leeks, which should be planted in spring, just so they have enough time to get big enough. So what I'm saying here is, like, let's say you start your radishes in February, the radish might get really big. It'd probably bolt by the time it gets to the summer. And same with a lot of brassicas and things. You'll probably, instead of planting really early spring, if you're planning to store it over winter, it's better to plant it more in June or even in the fall, depending on the crop.
Siri, there's a question in the chat. Just maybe explain why you wouldn't, it says, I might have missed some words in your explanation, but why not save seeds from biennials that bolt the first year to eventually have these varieties having an annual life cycle?
You could certainly do that. It's just a lot of farmers, for example, if they don't necessarily want, because as soon as something bolts, it goes woody on the inside. So let's say you have your population, and even if a few bolt, it's just kind of annoying to sort out of them. But you definitely, it might be desirable for you to be able to do a production within 1 year. It's just generally not desirable to have bolting crops, as you can't really eat them as well once they've bolted. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. Great. And then the right size to store varies depending on the crop. So for most root vegetables, a size between a golf ball and a baseball is usually best. That's a good general rule for thumb. And then for plants of greens, a plant should have a few ready-to-eat leaves. So let's say you are starting your kale, you started it, let's say in June or whatever. Before you store it, you'll want to, have a few leaves that you could eat. And then carrots and parsnips should have a small to regular sized root. You don't usually want to use the biggest ones, but just a normal sized carrot or parsnip works great. So preparing for storage. So once you have your biennial crop, whether it's a root vegetable or it's a leafy green, you should determine whether you would be able to overwinter and vernalize that crop outside, or if you should store indoors over winter. This will be highly dependent on your climate. So I thought I would just open a floor to see what crops people have successfully been able to overwinter outdoors and specify their climate was a certain variety. So feel free to write in the chat, because then we can share some information on what varieties worked well. I know at our seed farm, we've done white winter kale, winter rainbow kale. We've done a few different kale varieties that have done well. And then, yeah, I don't know if David or Lisa want to let me know if they have any other varieties that stayed outside well in their climate.
Ford Hook chard works for me on the coast, but some of the other chards all die. But for whatever reason, Ford Hook's the hardy one.
Yeah, and there's a comment from Carla out in near Calgary that it's too cold to overwinter anything there in that part of Alberta. So yeah, if you have access to a polytunnel or a sunken greenhouse or something like that, you may be able to limp some stuff through. There's a comment, snow can make a big difference. as well. It says for isolation, but I'm guessing it means to insulate your crop. If it gets some snow on, you're usually better off over the winter.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's a comment in the chat. Sorry, somebody talking? There's a comment in the chat that without planning for seed capture, they've successfully overwintered carrots when there's good snow early in the winter or with straw leaves. So yeah, I know at our farm I can overwinter carrots in the ground. The cold won't kill them, but we have really big vole population here in the winter, so usually they get eaten. So it just really depends where you are.
Yeah, we also did the radicchio, the Bottiglione. We left that outside all of last winter, and that was fine. And a lot of radicchios are supposed to last through January. But yeah, the voles for sure. Yeah, a lot of root crops we'd probably be able to keep outside if it wasn't for pest pressure. But that's all in the lower mainland. I think it's more difficult. So in general, if your temperature routinely dips below -5 or -7 outside, you should store in a basement or a cellar or a fridge or really whatever you have available, or even a greenhouse or something like that. Biennials are usually fine to hit a couple light frosts, but you do want to make sure you dig up your plants before it reaches -6 degrees. Generally, a few nights left in -2 to -5 is a perfect time to store your biennial plants. If you notice, like right now in the lower mainland, we've had a couple dips below freezing. We still have our carrots outside, but they're doing fine. But right now is a perfect time to kind of harvest all of those root crops before it gets even colder. But they're totally fine to hit a few frosts. However, as long as you have a cool storage location, it's fine to harvest earlier. Like if you do have that pest pressure, you don't have to wait for it to go under to a negative degrees for a few days. And then when you're storing your root crops or your plants, your leafy green crops, whatever biennial you have, you want a cool, moist area with temperatures just above freezing. So 1 to 4 degrees is ideal. So this could be a basement, a root cellar, a fridge, a walk-in cooler. Yeah, all of those things work well. So when you're preparing for storage, you want to cut all to almost all of the leaves off, but be sure not to damage the main stem. So if we're looking at root crops, in this picture you see parsnips, and you can see that just kind of a little nub was left. And it would look very similar for carrots, for beets, any of those root crops. You just need about an inch of the main stem, but you want to take away most of the outer or all of the outer leaves, because those, when they're stored, the water goes through the leaves in a process called transpiration, and it'll slowly take the moisture from inside those root crops and expel it through the air. And then for leafy greens, the main growing point is at the top of the main stem. So you'll want to take off any of the leaves that are not part of the main, that are not part of the main stem. But if you have something like a Brassica oleracea, even if you damage that main stem, they'll still grow. But just in general, for most things, you'll want to avoid harming that main stem. And then you'll want to keep the dirt around the roots and heal them into a container. There's different options. You could also cover it with a plastic bag. So just, dig up your crop, keep the dirt around, put it into a bin and stick that into your cooler, or cover it with a plastic bag. All sorts, those kind of options work well. And then if you have carrots or something, you might want to make sure they're kind of facing upright. So I'll just, I have a little bit about that in a couple slides.
Somebody's just asking for clarification on the term heal in.
Oh yeah, so that just means kind of to dig a kind of trench, I suppose, like to take, let's say you're going in a greenhouse or something, you can just kind of bury the crop further down than you would just to keep it a bit warmer. Um, yeah. Or
it's
just kind of introducing it into a new media. Like if you have a tub, healing it in might just involve moving it into that container and covering it with extra soil. I don't know, David, do you have a better explanation?
Yeah, it's just, so I'm basically covering the roots up with soil, something that's going to
Mhm.
keep the roots like healthy and living.
Great.
And I know somebody's asking how would it work in a root cellar? Yeah, same thing. I usually put them in a tub, so you don't just have a pile in your root cellar, but you could certainly just make a pile of soil and make sure the roots are all planted into it in the root cellar. You stick it in tubs, it's just easier to move out when you go to replant.
Yeah. So here's a quick EFAO experiment. So from Ontario. So two methods of cabbage production were tested. One was the pyramid. So they just cut off the cabbage to be kind of a pyramid shape. So got rid of the round bits. And then you could still use those outside bits for salad, but you can't really sell just parts of a cabbage. And then the other method was chopping the whole cabbage head off in the winter, spring, and then they sold it. So what they found was, economically speaking, they were able to sell the cabbage and the seed, the chop method won. However, on a seed quality standpoint, the pyramid method produced higher quality and quantity of seeds. And they kind of explained it by, in the picture on the bottom left, you can see when you chop it, you get rid of some of those auxiliary nodes. And then because you don't have those nodes, that's where some of the stems for growing seeds would come from. So you're kind of eliminating, depending on how tall your cabbage is, you're eliminating some of those potential nodes for seed production stalks. So then media for storing crops. So crops, whether it's as we were talking about before, kind of leafy greens, just keeping the soil around the roots. And then for things like root crops, they can be stored in a lot of different moist mediums, such as sawdust, sand, or shredded leaves. You don't want to leave them in a media that's too wet because that might cause rot. And you might not even necessarily need a media if it's a really moist location, though generally I would recommend having a media. And then, yeah, I thought I would just open, yeah, in this picture on the right, you can see beets getting ready to store with a wood chip based mulch. So you can kind of see the wood chip based mulch in the bottom, and they've got all their beets, and you can kind of see in the picture, there's just little tiny growing points of those beets left. So I thought I would just open the floor again to hear any successes people have had storing over winter, any failures. I feel like we learn just as much from our failures as we do our successes, and then any tips or tricks for people have for storing their crops over winter.
Yeah, I've had lots of failures. There's a question here about does sand work well for healing something in? And as you mentioned, definitely I've had failures with sand and successes. I think the sand needs to be clean. I mean, basically you don't want to harbor any types of diseases that might be able to spread through the winter, and that moist, you know, if the sand's moist and it's not kind of clean, fresh sand, and there's other types of pathogens in there, it can spread. So I've definitely lost crops because the sand was too moist. I'm curious to know what people are using. This year I actually decided to use peat. And I don't know if people have used peat to store things like carrots and radishes before, but I'm trying that out.
Yeah, I remember David was just mentioning in our last video that somebody used a air purifier in their cellar. Because yeah, you're definitely storing things over winter for a long period of time. That's also sometimes why you might want to leave it in the ground a bit longer, because then it's just the less time you have in storage, the kind of less chance you have of a rot, destroying your crop. But then also the longer you leave it outside, the more freezing you might get, which also might harm the crop. And then of course there's also the outdoor pests, but in general, that's what I'll mention that in the next slide, but you also want to replant them pretty much as early as you can in the spring. I think the less time you have in storage, the kind of less problems you might run into storing.
I'll offer an example too, and it kind of just my experience with wood shavings work quite well. But I did notice one year I had them in a bin and they just dried out for whatever reason, even though they were in a bin with a lid. And so I lost a few from shriveling. Oh, beets, I'm talking about beets. And the next year I just did them in a plastic bag with holes, and that was like enough moisture. Plastic bag with holes in a bin. So it was still like, again, kind of sealing the moisture in, but guess it's just getting that right level of moisture.
I think that's a big part of it. It's like that tricky balance between having them moist and living and having them dry out too much. And the more moist and living, the more chance there is for disease and rot. Yeah, so.
Yeah, okay. With that, I'm going to talk a bit about forced fertilization. We've done this a couple times at the farm, especially with radishes. So it's just the idea of growing your typical biennial varieties all in one year. There's some crops that this often occurs naturally, such as broccoli and radish. So broccoli, if you plant it early in the season, it'll usually go to seed by the end of the season. You still might want to rogue out the earliest flowering broccolis, but it also might depend. Maybe you're looking to have a variety of broccolis that produce earlier and later, maybe unlike a hybrid where it's all at the same time. So, you might not rogue out. It's just depending what you're doing. And you might still rogue out the earliest bolting radishes. So this method would include planting your crops early in spring. So let's say we've tried this with Tokyo turnip and radish last year. So we planted them early spring, probably before around March, maybe beginning of March. And then we've let them grow till that desirable size, which I again mentioned is around a golf ball to a tennis ball, depending on a crop. Well, till they're marketable size. And then you'll put them in a cooler for about a month between May and July, and then replant the seeds and then replant the roots to get seeds all in 1 year. So that is kind of mimicking a winter in the middle of your season. So you take them out in May, you mimic the winter by putting them in a cooler for a month. And also just a month, it's a less, not as long amount of time in storage, so less likely you'll run into rotting issues or drying out issues, and then replant. So yeah, we've had success doing this with radishes. We've also done this with carrots, but that we've done by vernalizing them in November, December time, or even just December, and then we've planted them in a greenhouse at UBC. I don't think a carrot would necessarily go to seed outside, but when we planted the carrots in January, we had 1 year where we had a ton of seeds in early June, and that was very successful. And then last year we had that really wet and cold spring, so the seed was a bit delayed till more almost July. We tried this with Tokyo turnips, but unfortunately, when we replanted them, they didn't have quite enough time to go to seeds. But this would work pretty well. I feel like with radishes, it works really well to do it all in 1 year. Great. So here's just a couple pictures of replanted biennials. Yeah. So replanting your biennials next spring. So you want to replant in early spring as soon as you can work the soil. Even a few weeks before your last frost is usually fine. And then you'll want to ensure that the plants are spaced appropriately apart. So, for example, most root crops don't take up as much space in their first year of growth as they do in their second year of growth when they get flowers and seed. So carrots, when you grow them, or radishes, you might just sprinkle your seeds all along the soil, maybe thin them out a couple times. But when you're replanting them, you're going to want about, I would say, as a rule of thumb, maybe double amount of space that you would normally leave between them. So radishes, they'll grow pretty large, and same with carrots. You'll probably want even up to 2 feet, but at least 1.5 feet apart from each other. And also something that you'll want to be aware of is oftentimes, since they do grow quite tall with stalks and flowers that can get heavy, it's a lot more likely that you might need to stake these plants. And especially if you're trying to get a really high seed production, you don't want your seeds on the soil. Staking your plant to grow for seed might be very useful for you. And then, once you've probably staked your plants or given them some support, and they've gone to flower, and then they've gone to seed, pretty much all biennial crops. So I can't think of a single one that has wet seeds. Annuals tend to have wet seeds, and by that I just mean a seed encased in a fruit. So all biennial crops have dry seeds, and then you can just use typical seed cleaning methods, which are threshing, screening, and winnowing to get your crops. Just as a tip, knowing when to harvest your seed is you'll just want it to be dry on the plant. So if it's in a pod, you might notice some of them are going yellow, but even if you're noticing, let's say, birds are starting to eat your potted plants, you can cut the plant from the base. You might do this and just let it dry in an area where birds and things can't get at it for a few weeks before you start the cleaning process. And then other crops, like let's say beets or chard, you'll just notice that the seeds should be quite hard by the time you harvest them. I'm trying to think of any other tips for harvesting your biennial seeds. Carrots and things can be quite tricky to clean. And some seeds like parsnips come in a lot of different sizes since they have that kind of papery. In those kind of cases, I would recommend, did I say parsnips? Yeah, I would recommend winnowing, because then you can kind of blow away the lighter seeds to separate them. And then things like carrots, it just involves a lot of screening. And yeah, they can be tricky, but you don't have to get them super clean if you're just using them for your backyard. Great. Well, that's the end of this presentation. Curious to hear if what kind of biennials you've grown to seed, and if you're storing any biennials right now or you're planning to for next year. And yeah, happy to talk about any questions. So thank you. I'll just stop my screen share.
So yeah, you can put your questions in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak up. There's a couple of questions we can start with. One is word question. What point did food growers begin the process of overwintering their crops? How many generations and cultures back? How historical is this practice, I guess? Just for clarification, I guess, like, you're asking about the practice of doing something like taking a biennial and storing it in a cooler or somewhere like that. I don't know exactly when that would have happened, but I'm guessing before we had things like coolers and technology to hold plants longer than they would be able to be held outside, we just wouldn't be producing, cabbage seed up north, or places that they couldn't live outside. So we've been able to, I guess, push the edges of where we can produce those seeds in those places. The process of overwintering crops and saving seeds, I think, is thousands of years old, but the process of using more modern storage technologies to do that in areas that they wouldn't naturally do it, I think, is probably within the last 50 to 100 years. There's a question here about more detail on methods of thresh, screen, and winnowing these seeds would be great.
Okay, yeah. I'll go through a few different types. So like carrot seeds, I definitely like using a car mat. I feel like can be quite nice just to scratch it against the car mat. That's a good at-home one. And then let's say you have like anything in a pod, radishes or brassicas, I'd recommend just putting them in a bin and stomping. That's probably the easiest method. And then for things like onions and leeks, not onion leeks, sorry, just onions, I'd say stomping too. Honestly, stomping works really well. And then things like radish, beets, and Swiss chard, the seeds are quite attached to the branches. I'd still stomp on them. I might even, sometimes they fall off. If you might want to even put like a landscape fabric around it and just kind of collect what falls off, might be a solution. And then screening them. Screening works really well for all the seeds that are round, or even the onion seeds, it works pretty well. And yeah, hardware cloth or colanders from kitchens. For winnowing, an air compressor works really well. So after you've got all your material threshed, air compressor works well. Or if you don't have one of those, a hair dryer works pretty well. Or even just laying them out on a big, kind of a flat, long bowl, and in a windy day, just kind of checking it up and down to get anything blow out. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other seeds.
Looks like Carla's got her hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. Two things. I was wondering if you could go back to the biennial flowers slide. I just wanted to write down some of the flowers that are biennial. And then my question is, what are some tips or advice on overwintering leafy vegetables? So like kale and Swiss chard. Yeah, I feel pretty good about like, being able to do beets or carrots, things like that, like putting them in the sand or the material, but I feel like a leafy would have a much higher chance of rotting. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that, please.
Wait, am I muted? No, I'm not. Yeah, for leafy greens, anybody else feel free to speak up for this. Yeah, as I said before, just like removing the definitely outer leaves and just kind of leaving the main on the inside. Yeah, and then for something like celery, yeah, again, kind of like making the plant small and just yeah, big tub, leaving in the roots with the dirt. Yeah, and then I don't know, David or Lisa, I know I haven't done Swiss chard, so I'm not quite sure. Somebody has something to say on that.
I think, Lisa, you've done chard before?
I have, but I feel like I haven't done a very good job of it. Mostly it's like leaving it out in the field and seeing which ones survive. But probably taking off leaves, and that would help because they just get slimy. But I found that the golden one is the hardest to save. Even with our mild winters in Victoria, it's tricky. It just dies. But if I have depending on the size of the plant, like the plant has to be kind of like not tiny and not huge. That sort of helps.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, there's the same thing, like younger plants survive better than older plants. So something like, yeah, Swiss chard, you probably wouldn't want to be planting in early spring. You'd probably rather be planting in like June to save that over the winter because it'll get big enough. And then, Yeah, other leafy greens. Yeah, I think just like delaying the planting for sure and taking off a lot of the outer leaves, so less to transpire through. It is tricky though.
Great. And then what kind of temperature would we want to hold them at? I would be doing inside storage for any.
Yeah, like just above freezing, so like 1 to 4 degrees.
Yeah.
I threw those the flower varieties in the chat there as well, if anybody wants to see them.
Okay.
There's a question here. I'm going to be growing out for seed cabbages stored by someone else. I have been a failure at cabbage. This is a great way, actually. I've done this too. I plant my carrot crop and something happens to it, but I really want to grow seeds next year. And you can find somebody who's done a good job of growing those roots and buy the roots from them to replant. So you can definitely do biennial crops like that. You don't have to be the grower of the root stock necessarily. If you go to a farmer's market and you can dig through the bin and do some selection, and that you can find out the variety, you could probably get enough roots to do your own seed at home. But can you give a brief step-by-step on how to replant the cabbages?
Yeah. So you've stored them with most of the soil around, and then springtime comes, you can work your soil, and I don't know, you might want to add some nutrients or compost to the soil to help it grow. And then you'll just want to stuff like cabbage, like it's pretty hardy. Even if the roots are like, even if you disturb the roots, it won't be that big of a problem. But still, try to, if you can, don't disturb the roots and just kind of dig it up with all the soil that's already been with it and plop it in. Make a bigger hole than you think you'll need. That'll just mean the soil around it is looser, so the roots can start growing again.
This person also mentioned here that they have ordered a roll of crop cover for insects, and I'll just remind you and warn you that when your plant grows, if you're trying to keep things like aphids off and little insects, the crop's going to get really tall. So make sure you order a wide enough roll so that you can actually have it over the whole crop. If what you're trying to do is protect it throughout its growing life. You probably don't have to worry about things like flea beetles as much on a second year crop like that, because the plant's pretty far ahead and they might not affect it. There's a question here. Sorry, did you finish with the?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. There's a question about grading beet and chard seed. Is it necessary? Are the really small ones as viable as larger?
That's an interesting question, because beet and chard seeds, they're actually more than one seed. Like, it's a cluster, so there's actually more than one seed in that cluster. So what that might mean is smaller ones will maybe only actually have one seed, and not usually it's up to 3 or 4. So when you grow out things like Swiss chard or beets, you almost always have to thin them out, because you'll get more than one sprout from one seed, because it is a cluster. So because of that, of course, if you have smaller seeds, smaller clusters, there might only be one seed in it. But it's that one seed still might grow, but of course you'll have a lower chance. So the bigger ones are better. But I'd say, like, compared to other seeds, I don't think it would be as important, but maybe that's just me thinking, because they're a cluster, that it wouldn't be as important if they're a bit smaller. But yeah, I'd still like grade the smallest ones out. But I think as it goes, since they are clusters, it'd be a bit less important than separating out your smaller brassica seeds, for example.
I think in general, seed size, like if it's a bigger seed, it might have a bit more juice. It might live a little bit longer. Maybe it has more of a shelf life, but keep in mind, genetically, it's not necessarily different. It came from the same plant. So it depends what your goal is. If you're trying to make the healthiest, biggest, fattest seeds, then yeah, you might want to separate those out. And what seed growers often do is they will grade those out and they'll keep the biggest seeds for themselves and certain selections for themselves and then sell the rest.
I just wanted to note there was a couple questions earlier. One was from Joyce. The photo of the beets in the crate for storage did not have roots touching soil. Is that correct?
Yeah, because they were still, I think that picture, they hadn't put it into that sawdust, not sawdust, wood chip mixture yet. They had just done their first harvest, and then that was going to be their next step, was to like put it in to that wood chip material.
There's a comment from Elizabeth on a certain type of caterpillar eating the flowers of her parsnips. So interesting. I've never seen that, but maybe other people have.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, those are the ones we missed, so we can go back down to the bottom there. Where were you at?
Great. There's a question here. This is interesting. Tips on how to teach biennial seed production to seed library participants. This is from Carla. Likely varying levels of education, practice, knowledge, and how can we try to verify that the seed has been saved properly? Oh, and there was a comment from Jolene, just as an aside, swallowtail caterpillars love parsnips.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's a very general, can think of that very generally for any seeds that come into a seed library, is how can we verify that the seed is being saved properly?
I think for biennials, I mean, I'd maybe suggest people just try to do the second year of growth. If they're really interested in growing biennials, like maybe it's the kind of thing they can buy carrots from somebody else who's grown open pollinated carrots at like a farmer's market and just plop those into the ground just so they can. I would also sell it as more of a like, see the flowers of this crop, you know what I mean? Like more focused on kind of experiencing the life cycle of a crop and maybe a bit less focused on the actual seed production itself. But I'd say one way to shortcut it, yeah, would maybe not to like have it 2 years, like just something that you get the roots, or do like a root. If somebody had the opportunity to store a bunch of beets or something and hand them out to different gardeners, because also have quite large population sizes, a lot of this. So it might be even more beneficial to, get a whole bunch of one variety of carrots and give it to a whole bunch of different seed library members to grow individually and then bulk up those seeds afterwards.
I think in general, like we are talking about crops that require sometimes more space and resources than most home gardeners have. So, but rather than saying like, oh, these aren't appropriate for a seed library, I'd love to encourage you to think of how you can incorporate them in. So again, like if it was done as a project with a number of people, maybe you have a farmer that you can engage to grow the roots out for everybody. Or maybe in order to get really good quality seeds, you just engage with somebody who has the space and the ability to grow good seeds for the library. The way you can verify if your seeds have been saved properly in a library is, I mean, asking the grower for enough questions so that you know that the grower took into consideration things like population size, isolation distances. You might have a question of like, did you rogue anything out? Did you do selection, or was this a mass seed saving? And then you have to believe them. And if you don't want to believe them, then you're just going to have to grow that crop out again, I think, and experience it and see how they did. Is there a correlation between bigger plants and better seed?
Kind of, but not really. Especially for storing like root crops over winter, you don't necessarily want them to be too big. And then you also, like I mentioned, like younger plants store better than older plants. So younger plants will tend to be smaller, but then it comes to things like like we saw in that cabbage example, like if you have a longer stem, you'll have more stems that will produce seeds. So I don't know if it necessarily, and then better, that's the question of quantity. Like a bigger plant might produce more quantity, but better, we did see in that cabbage example too, that where they just did the pyramid, I guess there was probably a bit more nutrients in the plants to send up to the seed. So I would say, like, yeah, you want it big, but not too big that it won't store well. But yeah, definitely bigger. It has more nutrients on the inside, so it should theoretically produce better seeds. I don't know. Any other comments, David or Lisa?
Yeah, it's I don't know, a little bit mysterious, but I think that answered it well. Also, Julia had asked how much mold on seed heads is acceptable, which is another good question. I do sometimes, like I have had super moldy crops, and then if I do a germination test and they're really low, then I don't include any of that mold. Like I'll try and keep it separate if I have a lot of seed, but like if I notice one section's really moldy, I'll like keep that separate so I can test that, and then keep the better stuff so it's not tainted with my moldy stuff. But
I think one of the challenges with that is like we say the word mold or we say the word fungus and we think they're all the same, but there's good molds and there's bad molds, and there's some that will affect your crop and some that are just, maybe they just look moldy and they'll be fine. So yeah, good suggestion to just check it, like check the seed, because we don't really know what the mold is or how it affected the crop. And then I just want to go back to that question. Is there a correlation between bigger plants and better seed? And actually relate it to the next question. Could you reiterate the definition of roguing? So this is about selection. So roguing is when you go out, say you've got like a row of plants and there's some that you identify as weak and you don't want them to contribute pollen to the next generation, you pull them out. So roguing is when you pull them out. Selection, you might go down the bed and you want to save most of the plants, but there's like 10 of them that are really good. And so you flag those. So those are like selecting the best, and roguing is getting rid of the worst. But in terms of bigger plant size and, better seed, sometimes when we look at, say we plant a row of, I don't know, radishes, for example. When you plant a long row of something, you often get fluctuations throughout the bed that's not genetic. It's based on where maybe the compost fell more at the front of the bed, or the front of the bed gets more water than the back of the bed. So you might have like, a long row of crops where all of the ones at the front of the bed are small and all the ones at the back of the bed are bigger. And when you go and make your selection, say I want like fast growing big beets, so I'm trying to select for ones that are earlier and bigger, you don't go just to the end of the bed where they're all bigger. You go to the front of the bed where they're smaller and you choose the biggest of the smalls, and you go to the bed where they're bigger and you choose the biggest of the bigs. But you don't assume that just because all of the ones at the one end of the bed are big, those are the best ones to check, to save. You have to compare them to the ones that were growing in the area to do the best selection, I think. And then the size of the seed probably has more to do with, like, again, the storability and lastability of the seed, not necessarily the genetics that you're carrying forward. Oh, interesting. There's a comment here from Ruth that in their seed library, most carrot seeds come from community garden plots that have been from previous owners, and they leave the carrots to flower for education about biennials, save the seeds, share, but don't continue to save seeds after that. And that's a good strategy too, because inbreeding doesn't happen immediately, but if you keep saving seeds of the same variety with too small a population over years, you end up with a smaller, less vigorous seed. So if you save seeds from a small population 1 year, it's probably fine, but good to keep in mind not to continue propagating those from small population. And again, it would be potential in a community garden or a seed library project to have, if you have 10 people growing out carrots with too small a population and you gather all of those seeds and bulk them together, you actually increase the genetics of everybody's seed. So everybody saves from slightly less population. It's not ideal, but it's probably better to have them all in one big field, but it can get you around that problem of not having enough space in each person's garden. Can't wait to see what group projects come out of this.
Another one I found, another biennial I found kind of easy to do. I haven't done a lot of biennials, but parsley is a good one for people who are just kind of dabbling into biennials. Because it's so hardy. It's got these crazy monster roots, which are like so fun. And I like sometimes I've had the germination not be the most amazing, but you get so much seed that it's kind of a fun one to try.
Might even be able to survive the Calgary winters too. I've definitely seen parsley come back. So yeah, okay, that's a cool one. I'm gonna give that one a try.
They're also fairly uniform. Like I find, I don't know if maybe you don't have to worry quite as much about inbreeding because, yeah. There's a question. So regarding seed planting, should I plant seeds from 2020 and from, so is the question planting seeds from 2022, bulking? So it's kind of like taking, yes, as long as, again, as long as you didn't, say I saved carrot seeds from like a population of 20, I can replant them for 2020, but if I'm gonna save seed again, I probably wanna use other seeds as well that have genetics from somewhere else so that I'm not growing that same seed lot out and then saving a small population. One grizzly bear dug up my parsley and ate the roots. That's funny. I sorry, it's not funny. But we did meet with a farmer last year that lost all of his, what was it? I think he lost rutabaga, an entire crop of rutabaga or something to a grizzly bear. So yeah, he had his field electric fenced when we were there because of that. And feel free to speak up if that didn't answer the question about replanting seeds for multiple years.
Yeah, my dog really liked the rutabagas, so I can imagine a grizzly bear would like them.
Okay, great, thanks.
That bear might have got some grizzly gas though.
Are there any further questions?
Do we have time to talk about germination testing practices?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When is this session supposed to go for another? We have a bit more time.
Yeah. I would say for like a home gardener level, testing between 10 to 20 seeds is enough. For like CFIA standards, I think you need 100 seeds. But I would do 10 to 20. And then what I would do is probably use, what I've done in the past is use a paper towel and just lay out the seeds kind of in a straight line, like 10 of them, and then roll it up. And then depending on the seed, you're either going to want to leave it somewhere warm or somewhere not so warm. So like peppers, tomatoes, anything that's like you would think would be in a hot climate. I have heated floors and it's really hot in my bathroom, so I left them all in my bathroom on the heated floors. But on top of the fridge might be a good place, or near a furnace. But if you have things like lettuce, you don't necessarily need it to be warm. So yeah, I like to lay out 10 seeds on a paper towel, roll it up, keep it moist, and then just every day go and check. And if it's sprouted, take it out and leave it for, however long, maybe a week. 5 to 7 days is usually long enough for enough seeds, going through and taking out your seeds. And then at the end of the week, you can just see what's not left and then just subtract that from 10. That's usually what I do. I don't know. David, Lisa, any other comments on seed germination testing?
Sometimes I don't know if there's a guideline around this, but some of the smaller seeds I find need longer than that 7 days, and I'll leave them for 10 days, sometimes even 2 weeks, depending on which crop. Basil, I feel like takes a long time before it germinates, and not that that's a biennial, but but yeah, that's the only thing. The other thing I don't roll them. I have rolled them in the past, but sometimes I find it easier if you have the space to not roll them. I find it kind of screws up my counting a little bit when I go to count them, because they sort of like stick on both sides of the paper towel. So it's just my experience. Oh, and the other thing is, and maybe you could speak more to this, Siri, is sometimes your seed has like a really long, like you actually need to vernalize your seed. So like, or it might need like a whole other year, and then your germination will improve. So if you ever have germination results that are 0, just question that and don't throw out your seed, because you might test it again and then get a much better result. And that's happened to me a few times with different crops.
Yeah, there's some seeds that just need either time, so have a bit of a dormancy, so they might just take an extra year just in storage. And then some seeds and usually these are more like native seeds that will need to be stratified, so put in a freezer or something for a few weeks over the winter. But those are, you don't normally see that in cultivated varieties. You see that way more in native plant species. So if you have a native plant species, I would usually recommend to put it in a freezer or something. But if you have a cultivated plant, should be fine. They usually don't have those cold requirements. Yeah, and then some seeds, like we had last year an issue with our tomato seeds. I think because they were growing during the heat dome, something happened inside of the seed and it caused a buildup of abscisic acid, which is a germination inhibitor. And basically these seeds needed to be soaking for a really long time to get rid of that buildup of acid out of the seed, the germination inhibitor, before they could inhibit. Yeah, and then specific biennial seed germination testing. Yeah, I think it's the same pretty much as any other seed testing. And then if you're going like by CFIA standards, they even count, like if you have little particles in your seed, you have to pretend to germinate them, but just do your actual seeds if you're just doing it at home.
Yeah, I'll add to that a bit. Just that keeping in mind seed germination tests are like the germination result you will get at the best, so if you do a germ test and it doesn't come out that well and it's too low, try it again in a different environment. And it's okay if you got 70% the first time, but then you find a warmer climate, or maybe you were better at keeping the paper towel moist and you get a better germ rate. The higher germ rate is always your new germ rate. And I think you've already said this, don't give up on your seeds, because they can be dormant, they can get better. The other thing that can happen is and again, it's no different for biennial or annual seeds, but you might have a seed lot with a really low germ rate, And as Siri mentioned, when you germ test seeds, you've got to germ test randomly, whatever, like if you're testing 10 seeds, you've got to pull out 10 particles. If one of the particles you pull is a piece of chaff and you know it, you got to include that, because that's going to be that's going to end up being in, if somebody plants the seeds, that's going to be one of the seeds they plant. That's not going to work. So the cleaner your seed lot is, the better your germ rate. And then you might have a really clean seed lot, but some of the seeds aren't viable because they're slightly lighter, or they're not viable, and then they will be slightly lighter. So a further winnowing. So this is where getting the bigger, heavier seeds can sometimes increase your seed germination rate, because you're getting rid of the ones that are just not viable. So if you get a low germ rate, just work with the lot you have, try to clean it up as best you can, and sometimes wait a year. Somebody left in the chat something from Dan Brisbaugh about where he germinates seeds. So some people do. I know of one farmer, Frank Morton from Wild Garden Seeds. He does all his germ tests in the soil, because in his mind, he's like, that's where people are going to plant the seeds. I want to see how my seeds do in the actual environment they're growing, not in the best available space that they can grow in. So that's a really interesting way to think about it as well. So it looks like Dan uses like some of the things he puts in sand and some he puts in between paper, and it's again, whatever method you use, you're just looking to find the most ideal environment for those seeds to germinate. So whatever works best for you, I think.
I've never used blotter paper. Is that like a certain type of paper for germination?
I think so. Like, so what we've used in the past is I've just used, brown paper towel type paper. But through BC EcoSeed one year, we did get a whole stack of germination paper, which I think is what you're referring to as blotter paper. It's a little thicker and it holds the moisture a bit better. It doesn't get soggy and fall apart. But you certainly don't need that. Paper towel works fine. Oh, our coffee filter's a sub for blotter paper. I bet they'd work great. I think anything, again, anything that ideally something that holds together, that doesn't fall apart, that holds moisture but doesn't get too soggy. Yeah.
Great.
Are there any more questions? Okay. I think we're fine to end this a bit early. I think I just wanted to put a couple things in the chat. I don't know if people here, do you have link to the survey, Lisa? Sorry, I just realized I don't have that.
I've got it.
It's super helpful if you can help us fill out this the survey. We're just trying to gather feedback from each session, and it helps us for so many reasons, just to hear how you find this, so we know how to adjust these type of events in the future. And we do get funding from various sources, and it's really helpful for us to be able to report back to them that the projects we're running are useful. So thanks so much ahead of time for filling that out. I will also mention the Citizen Seed trial. I don't know if you have a link to drop in there. That is a variety trialing program that we run for home gardeners. This year we are hoping to use, we're doing early season crops because we're hoping to support schools to run Citizen Seed trial too. So if feel free, if there's teachers in your community, or if you're a teacher and you have a school garden you're working with, feel free to send people that way. We hope to be able to support school groups to do this trial a little bit better. And we are doing early season crops, as I mentioned. I think we're doing peas, radishes, and
salad turnips.
Salad turnips, that's right. So yeah, feel free to take part in that. And join us tomorrow. I believe tomorrow the session is, there might be a seed saving workshop in your local area in person. So if you check your email, you should be able to get a list of where those are happening. If not, there is a link to a video that's just a very basic seed saving video, the kind of a very general seed saving video. Feel free to watch that, and then join us at noon. We're going to have a Q&A session. We've got 3 people on the panel with lots of seed saving experience, and it's just going to be a wide open session to ask any kind of seed saving questions. So we hope you can join us for that. And thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for taking a break out of your Saturday.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Have a good day. I'll see you
Take
guys.
care. See you later.
Bye.